I'm often asked by people where they should start reading the Bible. I want to talk a bit about that today. Hi, I'm Warren, the rector here at St. Columba's. Glad you could join me for my message of the day. My advice is always to start with the Gospels, particularly Matthew, Mark and Luke, although you could just as easily read John. But Matthew, Mark and Luke, once you're familiar with all four Gospels, you'll see why I've said start with Matthew, Mark and Luke. It's a little bit easier to initially get into. And my advice is always to do a one sitting reading. Just read it right through like you would any good novel. And that's why I say Mark's a great place to start, because it's significantly shorter than Matthew and Luke. For a first reading, read it right through. And like you do any good novel, notice the plot, the characters, what is said, and just the feel of the whole thing as you read it through in one sitting. As you do that, you'll get a bird's eye view of the whole story. So, for instance, if you were to sit down and read Mark's Gospel tonight, you might pick up something like, in the translation, it'll be saying, often it'll go, Jesus will do something, and then it will say, immediately he got into the boat and did something. Immediately he did this. Immediately he did that. It's this sort of like, it's not in a hurry, but it's heading somewhere. And in the midst of all of this heading somewhere, he's healing, he's doing exorcisms, he's teaching. You'll notice his table fellowship with people, particularly sinners, his parables. All of this is rolled up in this movement towards the cross. And that's the big thing about Mark. You really, if you read it as a sort of a novel, like a story to encounter, it'll really strike you how it's just moving towards this great moment on the cross where everything starts to fall apart. The sky goes dark, the great curtain in the temple is torn in two. Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's been deserted, rejected. I mean, it's a stark contrast to what the story has done. You'll be struck by this when you read it, that it's so much is built into Jesus, so much expectation. It's so great what he's doing, and yet as time goes on, we see opposition arising, but then he dies completely rejected. How does this work? If you were to read the Gospel of Mark tonight and sit down and just read it, you'll get a sense of that, actually. And if when we do that, what's a handy thing to do is to put aside what we think we know, especially when we do a first reading. If we're coming to this reasonably fresh, try to put aside what you might think you know and be confronted by, encountered by the story itself. If you were to start with Matthew or Luke, all of those things I just said about Mark, most of them hold true to Matthew and Luke. But also you might notice in their Gospels, for instance, the very tough parables that you find in those Gospels. Or you might notice all the different titles in Matthew, Mark and Luke that are used of Jesus, Son of Man, Son of God, Son of David, all these titles which speak of his preeminence, and yet he will die on the cross. That's just some of the things to notice. But when you read the Gospels, particularly when you do a first reading right through, you'll be struck by this. But of course, after you've done a reading right through, when you've started to really start to encounter the Gospels, then there's time to look at individual passages that hang together. And they're the things that we can read over and over and get some real deeper meaning in the passage itself. Of course, when we do that, it's always in the context of that bird's eye view that we might have gained. But as we do this, read the whole Gospel through or different parts of it, it's worth working the text, working yourself in a way. What really speaks to me as I read this story? What do I know to be true? Jesus will say things you think, yeah, I agree with that. And when you encounter Jesus in these texts, where is he leading you beyond what you already know, what you're already comfortable with, or perhaps even what you don't understand? That's important, and I want to come back to that next week. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.